Welcome back again. Tonight we will cover a shocking true crime case from Germany with a lot of bizarre twists. Before we start, please like this video and comment down below what time it is wherever you are right now. Let's get to it. 6 months before the Hinterkaifeck murders, the family's maid suddenly quit, claiming the farm was haunted. Weeks later, Andreas Gruber found footprints in fresh snow that led directly to his home, but none leaving it. And then there was the strange newspaper from Munich he swore he never bought. These were the first ripples of something far darker. On March 31, 1922, a new maid arrived. By the next day, every person on the farm would be dead. What happened in those hours remains one of Germany's most unsettling riddles. It started with something small enough to wave away. Andreas Gruber noticed a newspaper from Munich lying in his home. It wasn't the sudden arrival of a letter or a strange item of value, but an ordinary paper. The problem was, he hadn't bought it, and no one else in his family claimed they had either. On any other farm closer to town, this might have been explained easily. Perhaps a neighbour dropped it off by mistake, or a visitor left it behind. But Hinterkaifeck was not like other farms. It stood alone, a half-mile from the nearest house, and surrounded by thick woods on one side and open fields on the other. The path that led there didn't see casual travellers. Strangers appeared only when they had business. In March 1922, life in rural Bavaria moved slowly, especially for families that farmed their own land. Deliveries or visitors were rare enough to be memorable. For that reason, finding a city newspaper that belonged to no one in the household was not just unexpected, it was strange. The home was days removed from Munich, and they had no regular reason to receive periodicals from there. Newspapers were paid for and delivered on schedule, not randomly. That meant someone had carried it onto the property. Andreas asked his wife, Cecilia, and his daughter, Victoria, if they had bought it or received it from a friend. Both said no. He asked again a day later. The answer was the same. At some point he mentioned it to a neighbour, hoping they might say they had stopped by and left it. None had. The newspaper remained without an origin, and there was no one else to ask. With only a few farms scattered in the area, each resident knew who passed through and why. Mail carriers could be accounted for. Regular tradesmen were trusted. No one could recall bringing a Munich newspaper to Hinterkaifeck. It was a loose end that would have been easy to brush away in a busier place, but here, in the stillness of the countryside, it carried weight. The question was whether this was simply an accident or the work of someone making a deliberate choice. Was it possible it had been dropped by a traveller cutting across the land? Almost no one had reason to take that route, especially in early spring when the ground was still soft and muddy in patches. If someone had walked all the way up, they would have been seen or left signs of their visit. The idea that it might have been intentional nagged at him. If it was, then the motive for leaving it could be more than just kindness or carelessness. Even without knowing the term, it might match what's now called a test intrusion. It's a small, low-risk way for someone to confirm whether a person notices an outside presence. Criminals or stalkers sometimes use minor disruptions, moving an object, leaving something behind, or creating a subtle disturbance to see how their target reacts. If the homeowner responds strongly, the attempt might be abandoned. If they seem not to notice or don't act on it, the intruder may feel bolder. Andreas brought the newspaper inside and kept it. Whether that was out of curiosity or because he thought it might still be useful isn't clear, but he did not involve the police. In the rural culture of the time, involving law enforcement over something so minor risked ridicule. The expectation was to solve small mysteries privately, or to let them drop. He may have also considered that reporting it would require travel, time away from the farm, and an admission that he had no clue how it appeared. As the days passed, he seemed to accept the lack of an answer. The absence of other signs, no missing items, no broken locks, no scattered possessions, made it easier to file the incident away. The newspaper sat as a harmless but unexplained object, no longer a point of daily discussion. In hindsight, it stood out because of everything that would follow, but at the moment, it was a small irregularity in an otherwise ordered life. On farms like Hinterkaifeck, routines were tight, animals were tended at specific times, tools returned to their places, and family members accounted for. The unexpected was rare enough to matter, yet even then, human nature leans toward assuming innocence over malice when there's little evidence to the contrary. Still, a single, unexplained detail can be a warning that's only recognized later. In this case, the warning might have been that someone knew the family's habits well enough to come onto the property undetected. In a community where every visit was noticed, that suggested familiarity and patience. Whoever left the paper wouldn't have had to force a way in. They could walk up the long track, stay hidden until the right moment, enter or approach quietly and leave something in plain sight. The fact that no one saw or heard them meant they understood the rhythms of the people living there. In modern cases, where similar patterns occur, investigators sometimes describe finding evidence showing an intruder had been close but not yet committed the crime. Sometimes they find items moved in sheds, padlocks tampered with but left closed, or harmless objects, like notes or newspapers, left where the homeowner can see them. The behavior is cautious, almost experimental. Had Andreas taken the newspaper as more than an annoyance, or at least told more of the neighbouring farmers, there might have been a collective decision to keep watch or to note unfamiliar faces in the area. A single family could be watched without them knowing, but watching a whole rural community unnoticed was far harder. Instead, the incident remained private, known only within the household, and possibly one or two neighbours who could offer no answers. That privacy may have been intentional. In small villages, spreading word about a puzzling event could start rumours. Not all attention would be helpful, especially for a family already carrying whispers about their personal lives. The Grubers had their reasons for wanting to limit talk about what happened on their land. Maintaining control over information gave them the final say on what was important and what wasn't. It's also possible pride played a part. A man of Andreas's generation was expected to protect his household without needing outside help. Admitting a stranger had approached without his knowledge might be too close to admitting weakness. Discretion in such matters was often seen as a form of strength, even if it left questions unanswered. If the paper was a test, the result would have told the person responsible exactly what they wanted to know, that they could enter the property, leave something, and face no immediate consequences. The family didn't change their routines in response. They didn't call for extra help, or patrols, or keep watch at night. Nothing about life on the farm shifted in the wake of the discovery. That stability, so important to the smooth running of the place, might have also been reassuring to anyone watching from outside. Over time, the unusualness of finding a Munich paper in the middle of an isolated Bavarian farm would fade in memory. But human memory also has a way of sharpening old moments when later events give them new meaning. In the week before the crime, several smaller incidents were recalled by those still alive to speak about them. The newspaper became the first in that chain, not because it was the most threatening, but because it was the earliest sign at which a choice could have been made to respond differently. When viewed on its own, it could have been a curiosity at best, the kind of thing that calls up short-lived conversation at the family table. But history shows it as a marker, the point where the trail begins to darken. At the time, no one at Hinterkaifeck treated it as a call to action, and so it became a footnote, until the events that followed brought it into sharp focus as the first visible ripple of something much larger. That larger pattern didn't take long to grow. Within weeks, other signs of intrusion began to surface. None were as harmless-looking as a newspaper left on a table, and each would press harder against the boundary between a private farm and the world beyond it. As the family kept their worries close, the quiet isolation that made the place feel safe would begin to change, and with it, so would the sense of control they thought they had over their own land. It was still cold enough for snow to lie across the fields when Andreas Gruber saw them. A line of clear footprints stretched across the white crust from the edge of the woods to the farmhouse. Each step pressed deep and sharp, showing the tread of heavy boots. They ended at the door, and then stopped. There were no imprints leading away, no signs of someone circling back. The only tracks visible were the ones that came in. Winter at Hinterkaifeck was quiet. With no other farms in close sight, snow stayed untouched for days, unless the family or their animals disturbed it. Anyone walking toward the house would stand out plainly. Fresh snow was like a record of movement, and here that record told a troubling story. Someone had walked all the way up, but never appeared to leave. The conditions made it hard to imagine a reasonable explanation. This was not melting spring slush where marks could blur. The snow was firm, and light had not yet softened it. To erase the return path would have taken deliberate effort, like stepping in exactly the same prints or covering them. The way the trail ended so cleanly at the threshold suggested neither wind nor accident. For Andreas, it was another puzzle to add to what had already been sitting in his mind. In that same period, he noticed the front door lock had been broken. It was a heavy, well-worn lock that had endured years of use, but now it hung out of alignment. It could still catch if pulled just right, but it no longer felt solid. The broken lock and the unexplained tracks made for a strange combination. One could be dismissed as weather damage or age, the other as a traveller passing by. Together, they hinted at someone not only reaching the farm, but trying to get inside, or at least testing how secure the entrance was. In a city, An unlocked door might not stand out as dangerous. On an isolated farm, it could mean that the barrier between inside and out was one shove from giving way. Andreas spoke about the footprints to a few neighbours over the next day or so. In a close rural community, such news travelled quickly between farmsteads. Visiting each other was part of life, and so was sharing concerns about strangers in the area. Some neighbours offered to come by after dark to keep an eye out or to help mend the lock. They did not treat his story lightly. In the early 1920s, theft from remote farms was not unheard of, and a bold intruder could do serious harm before anyone could respond. Help was a natural thing to offer, but Andreas turned it down. He said he could manage the matter himself. Whatever his reasons, they ended the conversation there. No formal warning went out to others along the road, and no one arranged a watch on the property. Even for those who suspected the situation might be more serious, pressing the matter was not the way things were done. A man's word that he had it in hand was often the final word. His refusal could have been shaped by many things. Pride was one, as head of the household. Admitting he could not secure his own home might be seen as weakness. Privacy was another. The Gruber family's personal life already drew whispers in the hamlet, and more visitors poking around might feed them. Fear may have played a part too. If the person who left those tracks was still nearby, facing them could risk more than a missing lock. There was also the possibility he simply did not believe the threat was real. Without direct confrontation, the idea of someone watching from the trees might seem too unlikely to warrant altering the daily routine. What would stand out later was not just the existence of the footprints, but the fact that they were ignored. In hindsight, they looked like an early sign of an intruder mapping the approach to the house. This is something investigators in modern cases note. Persons intending to break in sometimes test routes and timing before acting, making approaches to see if anyone notices. A trail in came without one going back might mean the person entered and stayed, slipping out hours later under the cover of night or through another path. If so, they could have been close enough to watch the family without being seen. At the time, though, with work to be done and animals to tend, life pressed on. A farm in late winter still demanded constant effort. Skipping chores or changing patterns over what could be dismissed as an odd track was not easy to justify, especially when each day brought tasks that could not be postponed. That thinking made sense to people who measured danger by immediate harm. Without clear evidence of theft or violence, the risk felt distant. The reality of rural Bavaria then was that homes were often left unlatched or with only simple locks. Trust in one's surroundings was high, and the space between neighbours meant not every approach to a house was seen. Even so, the prince bothered Andreas enough to mention them, and for others to recall his account later. But they did not prompt a safeguard or a search. Those who heard about the tracks before the murders would remember later how clear Andreas was about them stopping at the building. The image of boots cutting straight to the door but nowhere else took on a sinister shape after the killings. In reconstructing events, investigators would see it as evidence that someone familiar with the farm had been scouting it. With no return path to show, the most logical reading was that they had found shelter there, at least for hours. The broken lock's role is harder to pinpoint. Whether it was forced during that approach or had already been weakened, its failure would mean easier entry. If the killer had tried the door then, they might have learned just how simply they could step through later. Combined with the lack of immediate action from the family, it could have encouraged a second visit, one that would not end with only footprints in the snow. Small rural crimes then often followed a similar pattern. Visible signs that went unchallenged, followed by bolder acts. Without police called in early, because travel took time or the incident seemed minor, those acts could escalate without warning. For Hinterkaifeck, the escalation would come quietly. The prints in the snow were the sort of clue that only felt urgent once the outcome was known. By keeping the matter private, Andreas limited the number of eyes watching over the property. Neighbours could not help notice someone lurking if they did not know what to look for. That choice preserved privacy, but also left space for any intruder to move freely. From the outside, no sign showed that the family felt unsafe. Daily routines stayed visible, tending animals, moving between barn and house, crossing the yard. That steadiness, under most conditions a strength, could also tell a hidden watcher that nothing had changed from their first visit. It is possible Andreas believed that simply locking up more carefully would be enough, or that whoever came had already taken what they wanted. Either way, the farm did not see extra protection after the tracks. No neighbour was asked to stay the night. No tools moved near the house for defence. On paper, the incident ended as soon as the old prints were covered by new snow. Yet after the murders, that line of steps frozen in white became one of the most telling prelude scenes. Investigators piecing together the timeline could point to it as one of several events, showing someone approaching the family before the attack. Each of these moments could be seen as probes, quiet, limited actions to learn about the household. First a newspaper appearing without cause, then the solitary track stopping at the door. Both carried the message that an unseen presence had reached the farm without being confronted. The neighbours' offers of aid, turned away without much debate, became the missed chance to build a wall of awareness around the Grubers. In small communities, word about suspicious movement could make strangers stand out sharply. But that chance passed, and isolation kept the family on their usual path. No extra eyes, no disruption to the watcher's comfort. This refusal of help and the decision to keep possible dangers unspoken would mark the next weeks. Even as new worries arose, they would stay contained within the farmyard, and with each unchallenged sign, the space between feeling safe and being safe became harder to see. 6 months before the murders, the family's maid made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She had been with the Grubers for some time, long enough to know their habits and the rhythm of life on the farm. Work was steady, the pay was certain, and positions like hers were not easy to come by in rural Bavaria during the early 1920s. Yet she quit suddenly, and the reason she gave was that she believed the farmhouse was haunted. By then, she had seen enough of the property to understand that its location meant it was quiet, often without visitors for days. But she told people the quiet was not what troubled her. It was the noises, sounds she could not explain, especially coming from the attic. She said she heard footsteps above when everyone she knew was downstairs. Sometimes it was the creaking of the floorboards overhead. Other times it was faint but deliberate movement, as if someone was pacing. The attic was only used for storage, and there was no good reason for anyone to be up there at night. Yet the sounds persisted. The sense of being watched bothered her even more. She began to feel it while doing ordinary work, like hanging laundry in the yard or cleaning in the kitchen. The feeling was strongest when she was alone, and although she never saw anyone, she described it as if eyes were on her from somewhere just out of sight. In a farmhouse surrounded by open land, that feeling did not fade when the workday ended. It followed her into the evening and into her sleeping hours. Rural Bavaria, at the time, was a place where belief in the supernatural was common. Stories about spirits, haunted places, or bad omens were shared without much hesitation. A claim of haunting might not have been dismissed in the way it would be in a city. For the maid, those beliefs shaped how she interpreted what she was experiencing. Strange noises in the attic, the constant sense of being watched, these were part of her reason for thinking the place itself was not right. She stayed for a while, perhaps trying to adapt, but over time the decision to leave formed. Economic reality made that choice unusual. It was not a time when people quit stable work without a plan. Many domestic workers relied on those positions to support themselves and, often, to send money to family members. Leaving without another job lined up could mean weeks or months of hardship. That she made this choice shows how seriously the unease had taken hold. When she left, the Gruber household lost not just a worker, but a pair of hands that lightened the load. Life on a farm meant long hours of labor from early morning until after dark. Household work and outdoor work both needed attention, and without the maid, more of that burden fell on the family itself. Cecilia took on more household duties. Victoria helped with both chores and farming work, and Andreas balanced his time between tending to the animals, managing the fields, and keeping the property in order. Losing a worker was a setback, especially in the lead-up to winter. Her departure was mentioned later during the investigation into the murders. It stood out because it was one of the first pieces of information in which an outsider had expressed clear discomfort about the property. Other events, like the newspaper or the footprints, were kept mostly within the family or shared only with a few neighbours. This was different. The maid told people in plain terms that she did not want to stay there. Her reason, haunting, might not have been the language investigators would use, but it meant she believed the place was unsafe for reasons she could not fully explain. Later speculation suggested she might have sensed something more tangible than a haunting. Some who have studied the case have wondered if the noises she described could have been a person hiding in the attic. The idea is not without precedent. In other crimes, intruders have been found to live secretly in parts of houses for days or weeks, moving around quietly to avoid detection. From her point of view, she did not have proof of an intruder, only the repeated experience of hearing movements when no family member was in that part of the building. It is difficult to say whether the Grubers believed her account or thought it was imagination. In close-knit rural communities, accusations of a haunted house could bring unwanted attention. Superstition was common, but farming families often faced a clash between such beliefs and practical concerns. A belief in spirits might lead some to avoid a place, but publicly admitting fear like that could lead others to dismiss you as unreliable. If Andreas or Cecilia feared that talking about strange noises would invite gossip about the property, they may have chosen to downplay the maid's claims. Her absence also had a subtle effect on the family's self-sufficiency. With fewer people to split the labor, they spent more time on routine tasks, leaving less energy for maintaining security or noticing small changes in their surroundings. The additional workload could mean doors were locked less regularly if hands were busy elsewhere, or that animals were tended before daylight or after dark when visibility was low. In these conditions, an outsider trying to get close to the farm would face fewer moments when someone was free to watch the yard closely. From a modern viewpoint, her departure is a clear marker. It was the first human voice to say that living there had become intolerable. Unlike objects left behind or footprints, which require interpretation, her leaving was an action, taken despite the cost to herself, that pointed to something wrong. Investigators could only guess, however, whether what she felt was linked to the later murders. Without knowing exactly what caused the noises or the feeling she described, it remained a piece of the puzzle, but not one that could be confirmed. The timing of her decision is also worth noting. 6 months is a long gap before the crime, and yet it is close enough that the conditions she faced could have had some connection to the events that followed. If there was an intruder or someone watching the farm at that earlier date, they may have been studying the family for months before acting. If that is the case, the maid's experiences would have been an early symptom of a much longer plan. In a case where so little is certain, her story adds to the outline of unease that seemed to build in stages. First, a worker inside the home leaves because the environment feels threatening. Then, over the next months, strange signs appear outside. Objects where they should not be, tracks leading in but not out, locks damaged. Each step might have felt isolated to those living there, but from the outside, it forms a chain. The family did eventually hire another maid, but there was a long stretch without one. In that time, they adapted to working without extra help. That meant whoever joined them next would be coming into a household with a lot of responsibility resting on each person's shoulders. The replacement would also be stepping into a property with a recent history of odd disturbances, and in her case, into the very end of that story. The departure 6 months earlier had removed one witness from the household, someone who could have noticed and spoken about more of the strange activity. By the time the position was filled again, the tension on the farm had shifted into its final phase. The new maid, Maria Baumgartner, would arrive under circumstances that neither she nor the family could know were already set against them. She would not have the same months of warning the previous maid had felt. For her, the beginning and the end would come on the same day. Despite the strange events around the farm, Andreas Gruber did not want extra eyes watching over his land. In the months leading up to the murders, neighbors noticed his reluctance to accept help that, in most situations, would have been taken for granted. He had already spoken to some of them about the footprints in the snow and the broken door lock. These were not small details in a place where people knew who belonged and who did not. Yet when men from nearby homes offered to stay the night or check the property at odd hours, he turned them down. The surrounding community was typical of rural Bavaria at the time. Families ran their farms with the understanding that neighbors would assist each other when needed. That applied to harvests, livestock trouble, bad weather, or any sign of suspicious activity. Distance between houses meant that it might take a while for someone to reach you, but once word spread, help followed. People often left tools in shared sheds or checked on each other's property if they were passing by. In that culture, refusing assistance was unusual, especially after mentioning concerns that someone might have been on your land uninvited. Gruber's refusals stood out because they went against the unspoken rules of the hamlet. You might guard your privacy on personal matters, but when it came to a possible threat, it was common sense to involve others. The offers to guard or investigate were practical. One neighbor remembered suggesting they could keep watch in the nights for a while to see if the stranger came back. The suggestion cost nothing but time. It did not risk public scandal, but Andreas chose to keep all responsibility within his household. The reasons for his stance were never put in writing. Those who knew him said he was a proud man, capable of managing his own affairs. Pride alone, though, might not explain the pattern. There was also the matter of the family's reputation. Rumours about Andreas and his daughter Victoria had circulated in the area before. The documented fact of their incestuous relationship had led to legal trouble years earlier. While people might still work alongside the Grubers in daily matters, the scandal remained part of their reputation. Allowing outsiders to linger at the farm could revive the talk or invite more attention to the family's private life. Mistrust could have factored in as well. In small agricultural communities, disputes over boundaries, livestock, and debts were common. Even among neighbours you greeted daily, there could be quiet grudges. If Andreas suspected that someone nearby might be involved in the disturbances, even indirectly, he would be unlikely to invite them into the heart of his property after dark. Declining offers avoided the need to share details he was not prepared to discuss. Fear is another possibility. For all his firmness with others, living with a sense that someone might be watching the farm could have made him cautious about involving anyone who might become a target. In that way, handling it alone may have felt safer, even if it actually left the family more vulnerable. Without knowing exactly who left the newspaper, made the footprints, or handled the lock, he may have believed that keeping quiet was a defense of its own. Whatever the reason, those decisions meant that no outsider kept watch over the farm at night. Opportunities to patrol, to spot an unfamiliar figure near the barn, were lost. In hindsight, each refused offer looks like a moment when someone might have noticed movements or heard sounds that the family did not. An intruder who knew the area could see that no extra help had arrived, no lights burned later than usual, and no dogs from other farms were being walked near the property to disturb the quiet. They could plan without interference. The refusal to involve the local authority also meant no official record was made of the earlier events. The police never heard about the strange newspaper, the footprints that stopped at the door, or the broken lock until after the murders. In a small district like that, word from the police to watch for strangers would have spread quickly. Without it, the intruder's movements went unnoticed beyond Hinterkaifeck itself. Some neighbors later questioned whether Andreas knew more than he had ever told them. That was speculation, but it grew from the way he balanced acknowledgement of the strange events with a clear unwillingness to act on them publicly. If he had a private suspicion, whether about a specific person or a hidden cause, he did not share it. For the investigators who pieced together the timeline, that gap became part of the mystery. They could not tell if his silence had been protective, stubborn, or based on information he refused to reveal. Refusals alone do not cause a crime, but they shape the conditions before it happens. Here, they meant the intruder had weeks, maybe months, without increased risk of discovery. In remote areas, even one extra person watching could drastically cut down on opportunities for someone to approach unseen. Without that, approaches to the barn or house could be tested at different times of day, and paths in and out could be learned without anyone intervening. Looking back from modern policing standards, the pattern is stark. Now, when small rural properties report unexplained entries or damage, police often encourage immediate sharing of details with the community. Even if there is not enough evidence for a charge, the extra awareness makes intrusion harder. In the 1920s, community watch worked only if the homeowner opened the door to it. In this case, that door stayed closed. It is also worth noting that in that era, the lines between home, farm, and field were more open than today. Boundaries were not always fenced, or if they were, they might be easy to cross. Larger livestock fields were shared spaces at certain times of year. Visitors or workers from outside the family could come onto the property without every step being noticed, and if no one had been told to watch for suspicious behavior, they would pass without a word. Without a signal from Andreas that the household was on alert, the people nearby would see nothing out of the ordinary. His refusal of aid also reinforces how isolated the family was, beyond the physical distance from other homes. It was a social isolation created by choice in some ways, and possibly by the lingering effects of scandal in others. In a place where much of life depended on trust and exchange, breaking that pattern effectively narrowed the circle of people with a reason to check in on you unasked. That left only close family in the loop, and in this case, close family meant the same 4 adults who would soon be among the victims. The offers of help were simple: an extra set of eyes, occasional nights spent on the property, repairs to the lock. Declining them left the family to manage risk within their own resources. That might have been enough in ordinary times, but if the disturbances were the work of someone preparing for a bigger act, it meant their work went ahead without disruption. The intruder already knew how far the farm was from neighbors. Learning that no one else would be moving in and out was likely one more confirmation that the farm could be approached on the intruder's terms. Every community has its own ways of managing danger. In Hinterkaifeck, the standard was mutual surveillance through regular interaction. Neighbors noticed who passed by, noted wagons or figures in the fields where they did not belong, and made mental lists of when a family was away. By shutting out those habits, Andreas took on full responsibility for identifying and deterring threats. That choice, whether made out of pride, mistrust, privacy, or fear, meant that no one outside the family could say what happened on the property in the days before the murders. To the investigators, that meant key opportunities were gone before they even began. The small moments when someone might have been spotted, a cart might have been traced, or tracks might have been followed, simply never occurred. The isolation was not just a feature of the farm's location, it was a result of deliberate decisions about who got to see inside the circle of trust. Those decisions could not be undone once the crime happened, but they shaped the path the case would take. At the heart of it, the refusals were part of the steady background to life at Hinterkaifeck during that winter and early spring. The family experienced unusual events but held them close, dealing with them on their own terms. To people outside, nothing seemed urgent enough to push past the family's wishes. And so the weeks passed, the ground thawed, and life on the farm continued its same patterns until the day a new maid arrived, stepping into those patterns just as they were about to be broken forever. On the afternoon of March 31, 1922, Maria Baumgartner arrived at Hinterkaifeck. She had travelled with her sister, who had agreed to escort her to the farm. After helping her settle in, her sister left, making her one of the last people outside the family to see them alive. The visit was not intended to be noteworthy. Maria had come to start a new job, one that would provide her with work and a place to live. She was stepping into a household she did not know well, and as far as anyone can tell, she had no awareness that this job would end before it had truly begun. There is little recorded about Maria's life before she came to Hinterkaifeck. Many domestic workers in rural Bavaria at the time came from nearby towns or villages, often sent by family or finding work through acquaintances. The work was steady but demanding. Duties could range from preparing meals and cleaning to helping with light farm tasks if needed. For some, the room and board arrangements made these jobs more appealing than seasonal labour or factory work, especially in smaller communities. Maria's placement at Hinterkaifeck followed the usual pattern. She would live in the house, take her meals with the family, and be on hand for both household and occasional farm help. Maria could not have known that this isolated property had been the site of months of strange and unexplained activity. Andreas Gruber had not shared the details of the odd newspaper that appeared in the home, the footprints that came only toward the house in the snow, or the broken lock on the front door. The earlier maid's departure after hearing noises in the attic was also a matter kept within a small circle. From Maria's perspective, she was coming into a new role in a quiet, rural homestead. The Grubers had work for her, a room ready upstairs, and there was no sign that she should expect anything unusual. Her journey to the farm likely started earlier that day in a nearby town. The exact train schedules are not preserved, but it would have been common to travel by local rail, or a combination of rail and cart, to reach a place like Hinterkaifeck. The last part of the trip was by foot or wagon, along the track that led from the hamlet to the isolated farmhouse. There were open fields on either side, and a stretch of woods in the distance. Like others seeing the farm for the first time, Maria would have noticed the wide yard, the well-built barn connected to the living quarters, and the house's simple two-story design. Her sister saw her to the door. Inside, Maria met the family she would be working for, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their adult daughter Victoria, and her two children, also named Cecilia and Joseph. The routine would have been explained briefly, including meals at certain times, assigned chores, and the expectations for her first days. Whether the Grubers mentioned that they had been without a maid for months is not recorded, but they must have recognized some relief in having help again. Maria took her things to the upstairs room where she would be sleeping. This was a private space, possibly furnished with a small bed, a table, and a washstand. Attic rooms in rural homes were often cold in late March, with the lingering chill of winter still in the air, but they were separate from the main family bedrooms. From her window, she may have seen part of the yard and the fields beyond. Looking inside at this stage, there was no visible hint of the unease that had been slowly building on the property for months. While Maria unpacked and settled into her room, the family went about their daily late afternoon routines. Animals needed feeding in the barn, and the evening meal had to be prepared. The farm would have been busy, but not frantic. Spring work was beginning, but this was not the peak of harvest. For Maria, the pace and setting were likely exactly what she expected from a job description: a working farm with a need for steady upkeep, and a household that relied on regular, coordinated effort. The timing of her arrival placed her directly in the path of what was about to happen. She had stepped into the story when the series of small, unexplained events was about to reach its conclusion. To her, this was simply her first day of employment. To investigators looking back, this was the moment the last person entered the house before the killings took place. She was the final change in the household before the attack. There is no evidence to suggest she was uneasy or suspicious during those hours. The afternoon passed in ordinary tasks, such as meeting the family, putting belongings in place, and perhaps lending a hand in the kitchen. Conversations would have been about schedules, routines, and what was expected. No one stopped to tell her that 2 nights earlier Andreas had turned down offers from neighbours to stay on the property, or that throughout the winter there had been incidents no one could explain. Her sister's departure left Maria in the company of the Grubers alone. That shift from the outside world to the closed environment of the farm was a natural part of domestic service, and Maria had no way to know she was also stepping into the final hours of everyone's lives. The isolation that might have felt peaceful to someone unfamiliar with the warnings would, to those aware of the situation, also mean that any danger approaching the farm would have no rival for miles. At that time of year, daylight faded early. As the sun dropped, animals were secured for the night and doors latched against the cool air. Lamps or candles inside provided a small circle of light in each room, leaving the outer edges of the yard dark. Maria's upstairs room, being away from the busiest part of the house, would have been a quiet place early in the evening. From there, she might have heard the muted movement of the family below, the low noises from the barn as animals settled, or the wind passing outside. Those simple sensory details were part of what made the hours appear uneventful in the moment. It is only in the context of the crime that this calmness feels like the surface stillness before something irreversible. The caretaker's presence in her room was as normal as Andreas moving between the house and barn, or Victoria readying her children for bed. Everything seemed routine, right up until the moment it was not. The important thing about this point in the timeline is that Maria arrived during the last stage of a long, hidden progression. She had not been there for the newspaper left without explanation, for the footprints that came to the house but not away, or for the broken lock. She had not seen the prior maid's discomfort. She had no background to connect those dots, and no reason to take special caution. That made her, without knowing it, as vulnerable as the rest. Her arrival also shows how quickly circumstances can shift from ordinary to extraordinary. Hours earlier, Maria and her sister were moving through the countryside, focused on getting her to her new position. Hours later, dusk would settle over the farm, with everyone inside unaware that it was their last evening. The barn and house would appear unchanged from the outside, and there would be no immediate sign to anyone passing by that danger had closed in. In the decades since, this sequence of Maria stepping into the household, the quiet afternoon, and the settling into her room has been seen as the final addition to a pattern that had been building for months. The moment marked the end of any opportunity for the household to prepare or change course. If earlier signs had been the beginning of a threat taking shape, her arrival was the point at which the plan, whatever it was already in place. Whatever happened next was going to happen with her inside the farm. Maria Baumgartner's first day was also her last. In that quiet window between afternoon arrival and nightfall, the unseen danger that had been circling Hinterkaifeck was ready to move. The routine of that day would give way to the violence of the night, and the stillness that followed would only be broken when outsiders finally came days later. For Maria, it was a job that never truly began, and a first night that would be her last. The next moments would bring the first steps of the killer's plan into motion. How did 6 people end up separated and killed in the barn without raising alarm? That question has been at the center of this case for over a century. Investigators who reached Hinterkaifeck found 4 of the 6 victims inside the barn itself, laid together in a way that did not look accidental. The arrangement of those bodies suggested the killer had control over the scene for a significant amount of time, and that there was a clear reason for placing them there. The difficulty for anyone trying to understand what happened is explaining how the killer managed to draw each victim into the barn without the others suspecting something was wrong. The first working theory from investigators was that the killer used the animals to create a reason for someone to check the barn. On an active farm, sounds from the stables could signal a real problem, such as an animal in distress, a broken fence, or a predator nearby. These were situations that demanded a quick response. If someone heard strange noises coming from that direction, the natural reaction would be to walk out and check. That theory, on its surface, could explain why each person left the safety of the house, one at a time. But later, examinations of the property challenged this idea. Evidence suggested that someone inside the house might not have heard cries or struggles from the barn at all. The structure was built with thick wooden walls, and the distance between the living quarters and the stable area was enough to muffle noise, especially if doors were closed. The barn itself was part of a connected arrangement common to Bavarian farms, where the stable stood under a shared roof, but was separate enough that work inside it could go unnoticed by someone in the living areas. The sound insulation from construction and materials meant voices could easily have been contained within the barn, masking any shout or scream that might have given the others time to run. With that understanding, the killer's task may have been simpler. They did not need to eliminate all noise. They only needed to prevent an alarm that carried back into the house. The first victim is believed to have been Andreas Gruber. At around 63 years old, He would have been the one most likely to investigate a disturbance in the stable. Once inside, in the shadowed area near the animals and feed, the killer struck. The weapon was the farm's own mattock, a multi-purpose tool with a long handle and a heavy, sharp-edged head used for breaking up soil and chopping wood. It was the kind of tool anyone on the property could locate quickly. After Andreas, the sequence continued. His wife, Cecilia, likely followed next, drawn either by curiosity over his delay or by the same noise that had brought him in. She, too, was killed in the barn. Victoria, the couple's adult daughter, was the third. She would have been alone in the house with her 2 children when she realized both parents had gone toward the stable but not come back. In a farm family, that kind of unexplained delay could not be ignored. Whether she also heard something from the barn or simply went to find them, her path ended in the same place. The youngest of the 4 found in the barn was also named Cecilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter of Andreas. She may have followed her mother or been called to the barn in some way. The exact order after the first death is based on reconstruction from body positioning and blood patterns, but all 4 were killed without alerting the others inside the living quarters. The first 3 were likely attacked without much chance to defend themselves. Reports later suggested that little Cecilia may have still been alive after the initial blow, injured and unable to escape, left in the barn alongside the others for hours before dying. The way their bodies were treated after death stands out. Rather than leaving them where they fell, the killer placed them together, stacking hay or straw over them. The layering did not look like an attempt at a full burial. It was more of a concealment, enough to cover the scene from casual view. Arranging bodies in this way requires time and a lack of outside threat. Each movement risks noise and delay, but here there was no rush. That detail, as much as the killings themselves, shows the killer had confidence they would not be interrupted. The choice of weapon and the setting also suggest a degree of planning. A mattock in a barn is easy to reach and quiet to use compared to firearms. Someone familiar with farm routines would know where to find it and how to handle it. They would also understand how to use the barn's interior to control visibility. Once a victim stepped inside and moved far enough from the door, the path back was cut off. Aggressive action could be taken without witnesses on the outside. Investigators considering these facts pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. The person committing the murders knew the farm well enough to predict movements, anticipate reactions, and use the property's layout for their own advantage. This was not the work of someone wandering into the area by chance. It required familiarity with the family's habits and the confidence that each victim could be approached separately without causing an immediate alarm. The barn's position, partly shielded from the main house, and the muted sound between them worked in the killer's favor. By the time all 4 were dead in the barn, the killer had already removed the majority of the household's adult members. That left only the infant Joseph and the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, inside the house. What makes this stage of events so stark is the precision with which it split the group. In a matter of hours, or possibly less, every person who could resist or raise an alarm was taken out of the equation. Each was drawn to the same location, under circumstances they were trained by life on a farm to see as routine. The conflicting evidence about sound from the barn remains one of the points that makes the reconstruction uncertain. If screams could not be heard, the killer's job was easier. If they could have been heard but were not, it raises questions about timing and about what the 2 people left in the house were doing during those moments. Some reconstructions propose that the murders in the barn happened very quickly, with each victim dying almost immediately after entering, giving the others little or no time to respond before it was their turn to be lured in. The care taken to conceal the 4 bodies suggests the killer was thinking about what might happen if someone arrived unexpectedly in the yard. A visitor might notice the absence of the family from the house, but stacked and covered in the barn, the dead would not be immediately visible. That act also removed visual and physical evidence from where it was created, making it slightly harder for anyone later to reconstruct the exact sequence. What it did not change was the overall impression. Whoever did this was in full control of the scene and the timing. The barn killings mark the point where the crime shifted from isolated incidents in the previous months to an all-consuming act that left no one on the property safe. They also show that the killer was comfortable spending time in one location with multiple victims present. Each act of violence increased the chance of discovery, yet the killer appears to have worked without visible hurry. That confidence says as much about their understanding of the farm's isolation as it does about their intent. It is in these details, the choice of method, the use of the barn's design, the concealment, that the picture emerges of someone deeply familiar with Hinterkaifeck. They knew how to use the environment to separate and control the victims. They also knew that once the adults were gone, the final killings could happen without any risk of serious resistance. When the work in the barn was done, 4 bodies lay together under hay. The farm's strongest and most capable defenders were gone. Only those inside the living quarters remained. The killer's next steps would take them into the house itself, where the last of the family and the newcomer, who had arrived only that afternoon, were still unaware of what had already happened just outside their door. After the barn killings, the killer was not finished. The 4 bodies lay concealed under hay, but inside the house 2 more lived, and, at that moment, had no reason to believe anything had changed. The distance and design between the living quarters and the barn meant that silence there did not mean safety. The killer now turned toward removing anyone left who could later tell what they had seen. The first of the remaining victims was 2-year-old Joseph. He was Victoria's younger child, still an infant in most ways. At the time of the murders, he was resting in his bassinet in a room inside the main house. A bassinet kept him low to the floor, surrounded by blankets or cloth, in an environment where nothing around him would have hinted at violence, only a short distance away. The killer's entry into this space would not have been contested. There were no defensive wounds on his body. That absence speaks to the speed and certainty of the attack. A single blow with the same mattock used in the barn ended his life before he could cry out. Maria Baumgartner was in her own upstairs room. She had arrived that very afternoon, gone through the process of meeting the family, settling her belongings, and being shown the spaces where she would work and sleep. After the barn killings, she was likely unaware of any disturbance. Without knowing about the unfolding events, there was no reason for her to bar her door or take up anything for protection. She was found in her bed, still in sleeping clothes, with no evidence that she had fought back. This lack of struggle is consistent with the conclusion that she was attacked, either while resting or in the first moments after seeing the killer enter her room. The use of the same weapon ties the deaths inside the house directly to those in the barn. A mattock taken from the property is easy to carry between the 2 areas and requires no special preparation. This choice of weapon is practical for someone already familiar with farming tools, and in this case, it was also consistent across all 6 killings, leaving no doubt that a single person could have managed the sequence without switching instruments. For investigators, the detail that there were no defensive wounds on Maria or Joseph narrowed the possibilities for how the attacks in the house occurred. A fight leaves marks not only on the victim, but often on the attacker. Here, the pattern was different. Both killings appear to have been fast, targeted strikes made without warning. It shows the continuation of a method seen in the barn, approaching the victim from a position of advantage and not allowing time for them to react. One of the most disturbing findings after the murders was that little Cecilia, the 7-year-old granddaughter, may have still been alive after her attack in the barn. Reports from the investigation record that she lay among the straw for several hours before dying, during which she tore out tufts of her own hair. This detail suggests both the severity of her head injury and the prolonged suffering she endured. It also means that while the killer was moving from the barn to the house to kill Joseph and Maria, one of the earlier victims was not yet dead. The calculated nature of proceeding with additional murders, knowing someone was still wounded in the other building, is part of what marks this crime as chilling in its control. This stage of the killings added 2 more bodies to the total and removed the last living witnesses other than the killer. The fact that these attacks were carried out without hesitation after the earlier violence reflects the same level of calm seen in the barn. There was no apparent rush, no evidence that the killer feared discovery in the moments between these acts. Even after 6 people were dead or dying, the crime scene showed signs that the perpetrator had the freedom to move at will between buildings. The locations of Joseph and Maria's bodies also suggested that the killer knew the layout of the home. There was no searching recorded in the scene that would indicate confusion over where people might be sleeping. Moving quickly to exactly where each target lay points to prior knowledge, either from visits to the farm in the past or from observing the household before the crime. For Maria, who had been there only hours, being struck while in bed underscores that her role in this was only to be counted among the occupants. There is no evidence that she was a specific target for any reason beyond being present. The quick dispatch of the final 2 victims also meant there was little to alter or clean in the home before the killer could do whatever came next. The barn scene, with 4 people hidden under straw, and the interior scene, with both remaining victims left where they fell, showed consistency in how the bodies were treated after death. There was covering in one location, none in the other, but in both cases there was no panic evident in those arrangements. For modern readers, it is hard to separate the killings from the knowledge that they were followed by an extended period in which the killer stayed on the property. But in the sequence of events as they happened, the move from the barn to the house is a clear inflection point. Up to then, there was still the possibility that someone inside could have been warned or escaped. Once Maria and Joseph were dead, that possibility was gone. The nature of the attacks inside the house aligns with a methodical approach. There was no wasted movement, no change in weapon, and no sign of hesitation. That level of control over a scene with multiple victims, spread across two separate interiors, remains one of the reasons investigators at the time, and later, have pointed toward a person comfortable within that space. It is not only the violence that leaves an impression, but also the composure with which the violence was delivered. Maria's first and only night at Hinterkaifeck ended without her ever knowing the history of the strange events in the months before. Joseph's brief life ended in the setting meant to be safest for a child, quiet, indoors, with family nearby. In both cases, those protective conditions meant nothing against an attacker who had already removed every possible source of defense. The absence of defensive wounds is more than a forensic detail. It illustrates the imbalance of power in those final moments, and the choice to execute the killings in a way that eliminated even the chance of calling out. The image of the wounded Cecilia in the barn, still alive as her younger brother and the new maid were killed elsewhere, adds to the weight of those hours. It shows not just an act of violence against each victim, but a sequence that allowed suffering to continue while the killer carried on. That absence of interruption, coupled with the deliberate completion of the killings, suggests an attacker who was willing to prolong the events rather than be satisfied with fewer deaths. By the time the final two in the house were dead, the total stood at 6. There were no animals harmed, no signs of ransacking in search of valuables, no immediate departure. The killings completed the removal of every human on the property except the one who had done it. What happened in the hours and days after would reveal that the crime did not conclude here. Instead of leaving, the murderer stayed, moving freely between the same rooms that had just seen the attacks. Later discovery would show that fires were lit, food was eaten, and animals were cared for as if the farmhouse was still occupied in the normal way. But at this point in the timeline, Maria in her bed and Joseph in his bassinet were the last in a chain of swift, controlled killings that ended any possibility of resistance. Instead of leaving after the murders, the killer stayed at Hinterkaifeck. For roughly 3 days, they lived in the same farmhouse where 6 people now lay dead. The details of what was done during that time make the case even more unsettling. Food from the kitchen was eaten, the entire supply of bread finished, fires were lit, sending smoke up from the chimney for anyone passing to see, and in the barn, cattle were fed and watered as usual. Someone not only stayed, but kept the visible parts of farm life going. Police later noted these details in their reports. The family's meals had been drawn from loaves of bread gone and basic staples reduced. Fires were not an accident or leftover embers, they were deliberately made. This meant whoever stayed there used the rooms not as a hiding place, but as a home. Tending livestock was another deliberate choice. It kept the animals alive and quiet, which also gave the appearance that the household was running normally. For someone familiar with farming, that would also mean avoiding the added noise or distress that could bring unwanted attention. In the days right after the killings, there were visitors to the property. A coffee seller, a repairman, and others came by for routine reasons. The farm had a reputation for privacy, so finding the door unanswered was not enough to raise alarm. Seeing smoke from the chimney was another reason to think everything was fine. Smoke meant heat, meant someone was moving around inside. Coupled with animals still being cared for, it gave no outward signal of what lay inside the barn and house. This ability to blend normal tasks into a cover for homicide points toward deep familiarity with the victim's routines. Feeding cattle is not something a random intruder is likely to attempt for days unless they know how to do it. Handling large animals requires skill and comfort, especially in an unfamiliar place. The killer not only had the willingness to do it, but seems to have anticipated that keeping the animals alive would ensure the scene outside looked undisturbed. The bread and simple food supplies were likely chosen because they were easy to prepare without much disruption. It is also worth noting what staying actually meant in this context. The killer was living among the evidence. Every room still held what had happened. In most murder cases, police see offenders flee quickly, worrying that someone will discover them or that the authorities will arrive. Here, the person responsible made the opposite calculation. They believed they could stay without being caught, long enough to eat, sleep, and maintain the farm's appearance. It shows a high degree of control over their own emotions. From a psychological view, staying could signal several things. It can suggest a lack of urgency, believing discovery was unlikely in the short term. It might indicate they wanted to remove or alter evidence. The longer the scene went untouched by outsiders, the more chance there was to change small details, take away items, or shift things out of sight. It could also mean the killer wanted to occupy the victim's space, an act seen in some crimes where control over both person and place is part of the motive. Whatever the reason, The decision to remain had consequences for the investigation. Any evidence that could have been preserved in its original state was being handled or moved for days before authorities saw it. Footprints, tool positions, and even traces of the killer's own presence during the murders could have been altered or destroyed in this post-crime period. And because neighbors did not suspect a problem, no one came to check closely enough to interrupt. The location worked in the killer's favor. Haar, the nearest small community, knew the Grubers as self-contained. In towns like that in 1922, it was not unexpected for a family to go about their work without seeing others for days. Some farms could go nearly a week without visits, especially between market days. Mail carriers came on schedule, but unless they were due, the gap between interactions gave cover for someone wanting to stay unseen. Even when people passed near the farmhouse, they did not see anything that pointed to trouble. The chimney smoke was a key part of this deception. It gave off the impression that fires were being lit for normal household use: cooking, warmth, drying clothes. The reality that the fire was being used by the killer was hidden. Feeding animals is another detail that would matter to anyone passing by. Livestock in distress can be noisy. A barn of unfed cattle makes a noticeable sound, and neighbors might follow that noise to offer help. Keeping them content eliminated that risk. The fact that the animals survived those days is a detail worth dwelling on. It shows the killer was willing to put in the time and effort to keep them alive, which suggests not just familiarity with farm operation, but possibly some attachment to keeping the property in order. This was not someone tearing the place apart in a rushed search. It was not looted. Most of the household's valuable items were left untouched. The use of resources seems centered on sustaining the killer's stay rather than taking goods away. From the perspective of those who later tried to reconstruct the timeline, these choices point away from panic and toward planning. A person who decides to stay for multiple nights must be confident in several factors: that no one will check in immediately, that they can meet their own needs there, and that they know enough about the space to move around without drawing attention. All three appear to have been true in this case. It is also worth considering what the killer's daily existence might have looked like in those 3 days. Meals prepared simply from what was at hand, tending to animals in the relative safety of the barn, spending time in the rooms of the house, perhaps even sleeping in the victims' beds, all while knowing that under the straw in the barn and in an upstairs room, the bodies of those who lived there remained. This scenario adds to the sense of calculation. It was not simply about hiding. It was about functioning within the space as though nothing had happened. The killer's choice to keep using the house, rather than abandoning it, meant that they shared the same walls, the same air, with the results of what they had done. That kind of presence over days suggests a threshold of detachment most people cannot reach. They did not leave when they could have. They did not destroy property. They did not leave animals to starve or fields to stand untended. In the outward details, they kept things in order. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that small changes were made that will never be known. Items might have been moved, documents or tools handled, and subtle traces wiped away. The idea that anything from those days could have been staged is part of why the case remains so debated. Without a prompt discovery, the scene the police walked into was already altered from the one that existed on the night of March 31st. In other cases where killers remain at a scene, it is usually for hours, not days. The rarity of a 3-day stay marks Hinterkaifeck as especially unusual. Investigators saw it as an action that moved beyond survival or immediate escape. Whether it was to cover tracks, to mislead, or simply because they felt safe, the choice to remain is one of the most disturbing features of the case. Neighbors who later tried to piece together their memories recalled seeing smoke, but thinking little of it. In the absence of direct contact, life at the farm appeared unchanged from a distance. Without an obvious break in rhythms, there was nothing to make them interrupt their own routines to check inside. That visual reassurance is likely exactly what allowed the killer to finish their time there without incident. This was the part of the crime that extended the danger past the violence. For those 3 days, the person responsible lived freely on the property. They were there when visitors came to the yard and left again, none the wiser. They were there each morning when the animals were let out and fed. The attack itself was fatal to 6 people, but the presence afterward shows an added dimension: confidence that the murderer had the time and conditions to remain in place. It was only when the farm's unusual quiet finally outlasted even the Gruber's private habits that anyone thought to press closer. The silence that followed years of isolation was, in the end, what forced others to step through the doors and see what had happened inside. Days passed before anyone stepped inside to find out what had happened at Hinterkaifeck. In that time, the farm looked, from a distance, like it was going on as usual. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney. The cattle were fed. Nothing on the outside suggested 6 people inside the property were no longer alive. On April 1st, the day after the murders, 2 coffee sellers, Hans Shirovsky and Eduard Shirovsky, made their way to the farm. They came to take an order as they had before. When they reached the yard, they noticed the gate to the machine house stood open. No one came to meet them. They waited for a while, calling out, but there was no answer. They decided to leave, assuming the family was away for some reason. At that point, there was no thought that danger might be involved. People in the area were used to the Grubers keeping to themselves. 3 more days went by. On April 4th, local mechanic Albert Hoffner came to repair an engine in one of the outbuildings. He found the same silence. For him, the only signs of life came from the animals and the dog in the barn. He waited for about an hour before starting his work. The repair took more than 4 hours. During that time, no one came out of the house, and no one spoke from inside. Despite the length of his visit, he left at the end without going into the living quarters or the barn. That absence of curiosity or alarm reflected how easily isolation could mask trouble. While these visits came and went without changing anything, people nearby began to notice smaller signs that something might be wrong. The absence of 7-year-old Cecilia from school was one of them. The family also failed to appear at Sunday worship. These gaps stood out because, for all their privacy, the Grubers rarely missed such fixtures in the weekly routine. These details reached Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who knew the family. On April 4th, Schlittenbauer decided to send his 16-year-old son Johann and his 9-year-old stepson Josef to the farm to see if they could find anyone there. When the boys returned without a clear answer, he gathered 2 other men, Michael Perl and Jakob Sigel. The 3 set out together to the property that afternoon. It was around 3:30 p.m. when they reached Hinterkaifeck. They headed first toward the barn. The building was large, connected to the living quarters, but distinct enough to be entered separately. Inside, the light was dim except where openings let it in. As they moved toward the area where hay was kept, they found an uneven stack that looked out of place. When they shifted the covering, they exposed the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, and the younger Cecilia. The 4 were lying close together. Each showed wounds to the head. The way they were covered made it clear someone had taken deliberate steps to conceal them. For Schlittenbauer and the others, the scene removed any doubt that foul play had taken place. From there, they went into the house. Inside one of the bedrooms, they found 2-year-old Joseph in his bassinet. He was dead, killed in the same way as the others. Upstairs, in a room set apart for the help, they found Maria Baumgartner. She was still in bed, dressed for sleeping. The position of her body and the nature of her wounds suggested a quick, fatal strike while she was resting. At that point, all 6 of the household's occupants had been found, 4 in the barn, 1 in a bedroom on the main floor, and 1 upstairs. News of the discovery travelled quickly through the surrounding area, drawing more people to the farm. That influx, while a natural reaction, had serious consequences for the investigation. Neighbours, villagers, and those simply curious came into the buildings. Some moved bodies to see them better, adjusted objects, and even prepared food in the kitchen. Each action disturbed the crime scene further. Police who arrived soon after were faced with locations already altered from how the killer had left them. In modern terms, much of the physical evidence was compromised before it could be studied. Traces that might have shown a sequence of movement, the exact position of objects, or the identity of the killer were handled, shifted, or worn away. Even with this, investigators began their work, examining the state of the bodies, the tool used, and the arrangement of the barn. The order in which the bodies were discovered also fixed the image of the crime in the public memory. The barn contained the family's 3 adults working the land and the school-aged child, while the house held the infant and the maid. That arrangement matched what investigators believed had occurred. The killer dealt with the adults and older child first, using a reason to draw them into the barn one by one before moving to the house to kill the remaining 2. For those familiar with farming, the barn naturally drew attention when something was wrong. It was the place where animals could be in distress or where tools needed for a task might be fetched. The delayed discovery meant the killer's time on the farm between March 31st and April 4th had gone entirely uninterrupted. During that period, they were able to eat, rest, and tend the animals without interference. The idea that these normal-seeming signs, smoke in the chimney, well-fed cattle, were masking a multiple homicide added to the case's notoriety from the start. The very habits that reassured visitors allowed the killer to avoid suspicion long enough to leave on their own terms. In the days after, the court physician Johann Baptist Ohlmüller performed the autopsies. They were done in the barn itself, one day after the discovery. Moving bodies through that space again, with many people still coming and going, further disturbed what might have been left to study. It reflected the limits of resources and practices in rural Bavaria at the time, where examinations were often done on site rather than transported elsewhere. The discovery also forced those who knew the family to reconsider the events of the months before. Now, the unexplained newspaper, the footprints without a return trail, the broken lock, and the maid's sudden departure sat in a line that pointed towards something building toward violence. Neighbours who had offered to help guard the property could see how refusing had sealed the isolation. The meetings with no answer in the days after the murders became, in hindsight, moments when the killer was likely only yards away, maintaining the illusion of an occupied, functioning farm. For the men who first walked into the barn, the memory was lasting. Their entry ended a period in which a killer had sole use of the property and began the official handling of the crime. But by then, the damage to the investigation's clarity was already done. The earliest signs that could have been collected, the order of footprints in the yard, the freshness of hay or feed, the specific placement of tools, were lost beneath the changes made in those first reactions by townspeople. Even with that, the discoveries laid out the full cost of what had happened. 6 people dead, each killed on their own land, most of them separated from each other in their last moments. The barn, which had been a place of work and routine, now held the majority of the family. The home, meant to be a place of rest, had been the scene of the final attacks. Together, they formed a crime scene that did not match any simple break-in or robbery, but something that required knowledge of the family's patterns and movements. The moment Lorenz Schlittenbauer and his companions moved the hay in the barn was the point where the hidden reality of Hinterkaifeck became visible. Everything else, from the visitors walking away days earlier to the work done by the mechanic, had existed inside the larger illusion that the farm was going on as usual. Once broken, that illusion cast all the earlier events in a different light. From there, the investigation would have to work backward, from a compromised scene, through the thin timeline of visitors and sightings, to a chain of unsettling incidents in the months before. What stood out most was that the threat had been present on the property for days, without any of the usual signals of danger. It meant that the real danger at Hinterkaifeck had not only arrived quietly, it had been given the time and space to stay until it chose to leave.